Hello viewers, welcome to True Crime Diaries. The case stumped investigators for years. 4 bodies, found dismembered, skeletonized, wrapped in plastic bags, and stuffed in 2 55-gallon steel drums in the Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire. And for years, no one could put a name to them, instead referring to the Bear Brook murders. A hunter walking through Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, on November 10, 1985, came across a large, industrial steel drum. Inside, he discovered 2 bodies that had been dismembered, wrapped in plastic bags, and skeletonized beyond recognition, according to Oxygen. It was determined that they were murdered between 1977 and 1985. An adult female between the ages of 23 to 33 and a young girl between the ages of 8 and 10 were later identified. Despite police efforts, little other evidence was found due to the amount of time that had passed and the location where the barrel was discovered. The case eventually went cold, and it was filed away in the hopes that new evidence would emerge. It would be another 15 years before the next clue appeared. Meanwhile, without modern DNA analysis, the identities of the victims remained unknown. Without knowing who the 2 were, they were buried in a nearby cemetery beneath a tombstone that read, in part, "May their souls find peace in God's loving care." The investigation had gone cold. On May 9, 2000, 15 years later, a second 55-gallon drum was discovered in the same location. It's unclear how investigators missed it over a decade ago, but the second barrel, like the first, contained the mutilated bodies of 2 young girls stored in the same manner. This new discovery, however, did not provide any immediate clues as to who the murderer was. The bodies were undoubtedly murdered around the same time as the first 2, but with no way to identify them and no other leads, the investigation came to a halt once more. It would take 17 years to identify the killer and another 2 years to identify his victims. Investigators were finally able to identify their man in 2017 using genetic genealogy techniques. Terry Rasmussen, an inmate who died 7 years earlier, in 2010, while serving a sentence for the murder of his then-girlfriend, Unsolved June. Rasmussen was working odd jobs in California under the alias Lawrence Vanner by 2001. That same year, he had an unofficial backyard marriage ceremony with Unsolved June in Richmond, though no marriage certificates were ever filed. June's body was discovered dismembered and buried in her basement a year later. Surprisingly, Vanner pleaded guilty to murder during his trial, against the advice of his attorneys. Using his fingerprints, authorities were able to connect him to the earlier child abandonment case. They also determined, through DNA testing, that the man was not Lisa's father, and an investigation to find out who Lisa truly was began. Lisa submitted a DNA sample to an ancestry website and discovered her mother's name, Denise Bowden. Denise, on the other hand, only had one daughter, Dawn. Bowden and Dawn, who had an infant at the time, went missing from their Manchester, New Hampshire home shortly after Thanksgiving in 1983. They were residing with a man named Bob Evans. Bob Evans was dead by 2017, and investigators suspected he killed Denise Bowden after they left New Hampshire. There were still many unanswered questions and gaps in Evans' history to fill, but investigators now had a critical piece of evidence. Bob Evans, or Lawrence Vanner, had lived in New Hampshire in the mid-1980s. He'd been imprisoned in 1988 for driving a stolen vehicle under the name Jerry Mockerman, and even earlier in 1985 for drunk driving and endangering children. He later abandoned that child in a trailer park, whom he had pretended to father and named Lisa. Following that, DNA evidence linked the man officially identified as Terry Rasmussen to the bodies discovered in Bear Brook. His daughter was one of the victims. "We believe we have found our murderer," New Hampshire Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Strelzin said at the time. "We must now identify and try to locate all of his victims." In October 2018, New Hampshire Public Radio released a podcast called Bear Brook that investigated the bizarre, one-of-a-kind case. The killer was identified, but the victims' identities remained unknown. The podcast rekindled interest in the case, attracting the attention of Becky Heath, a 34-year-old librarian from Connecticut. Heath began scouring the internet for any clues she could find in her spare time. She came across a post online from someone who mentioned the name Sarah McWaters. McWaters' half-sister, according to the poster. Other people who thought they were related to Sarah, one of 3 members of a family who went missing in the late 1970s, responded. Sarah McWaters, an infant, her older sister Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, and their mother Marlies Honeychurch made up the family. Heath continued his investigation, messaging some of the family members who were present at the time, when another name surfaced, Terry Rasmussen. Honeychurch was apparently with Rasmussen the last time she was seen. I was like, there's no way that's a coincidence, she recalls. This is huge, Heath said. At the same time, genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter used the victims' DNA to identify them in a cutting-edge technique that required the use of autosomal DNA, which is found inside the cell nucleus. It was previously thought that recovering autosomal DNA from hair strands that were no longer attached to the root was impossible, but a forensic lab in California was working on a new method to reassemble the broken autosomal DNA found in rootless hair. Ray Venter was able to identify the victims using this method after months of trial and error. Heath provided authorities with her tip in October 2018. In June 2019, the victims were officially identified. The only remaining question is who was the middle child, Terry Rasmussen's daughter and the 4th victim. My thought about this case. Police couldn't see the second barrel for over a decade because it was just outside the crime scene area. I can't believe this. It's terrifying that these women and children were missing for decades, and no one even knew. The system failed miserably. He did so much crime and escaped, for murder still he could marry and kill someone. What do you think about the Bear Brook case? I really appreciate your feedback. Thanks for watching.